In the light of the previous video, where I talked a little bit about my past involved with the manosphere, Redpill, and self-improvement communities, I decided that I would do a sort of post-Redpill how to get a girlfriend kind of video. Now, of course, I don't really know all that much. This is my own 2 cents, so of course, take it or leave it. But I think that, as I said in the previous video, there's a lot of flaws in red pill thinking and even just in regular secular thinking. So I thought that maybe doing a bit of a video, explaining the falsehoods and maybe approaching it in a more sensible way might be helpful, not only to my viewers, but any of you who are from other channels or from other creators. And so, without further ado, let's set a few categories. So I'm thinking of 4 different categories of people that we're going to address here. So the first one is going to be those people who are in a state to not only find a woman, but also to build a proper relationship with them. And there are not all that many of these people, I think. Because even the people who do successfully create relationships, often they're so warped in the way they perceive reality that this leads to a relationship that, while long-term, has a ridiculous number of problems and tends to lead to divorce fairly quickly after marriage. So this is people who get divorced fairly quickly in a lot of cases, not because of something unexpected like domestic violence or something like that, but because the aims in life of both of the partners are simply either not mature enough or not wise enough to really govern a relationship properly. And I would say that most people fit into the second category. These people who can find a woman, but they are unable to build a functioning, healthy relationship. This can be, as I mentioned, people who can build like a marriage and then it just sort of crumbles. Which, I mean, if 50% of relationships or whatever are ending in divorce, like, don't quote me on that, this is just from the top of my head. That would fit into that category. But also, sort of PUA types. Like, the number of, dates they've had are the number of failures that they've had in their case. These people are, in many ways, just as failing. In fact, in some cases, probably more broken than people in the third and the fourth categories. So the third category are going to be those people who are going to find a woman at some point, but they're not really in a state to find a woman at this point. So they might be, depressed. They might be addicted to various things. They might have serious personality problems. They might have a problem with sin in their lives. And this is what stops them from finding a relationship, because the sin obviously has an objective impact on how they're approaching human beings, and that's how, this is just how it pans out. And then the final people, either through no fault of their own or because they're destined to something higher, they're never going to find a wife, because they're not the sort of person who is really benefited by being married, right? So this could be people who are destined to be priests in the Latin Rite. These are monks. And this is actually a higher state than being married. So for those people who are like unhappy about their virginity, this is actually a virtue. It for people don't consider it nowadays. It's actually a virtue to remain a virgin. It's an aspect of it's showing that you have self-control, and it's also it leaves something good. It leaves like a opportunity to bond when you're married properly. Right, so this fourth category, all of 2, all of 3, and a proportion of maybe 4, maybe not 4 actually, but like 2 and 3. This is what this video is going to mostly benefit. Like 4 might find benefit because it helps them understand the world, and 1 might find benefit because either they want to tweak around in my head, maybe I've got things wrong, but also like they might be able to grow and say, hey, I never thought of that. So this is what that video is aimed at, mostly 2 and 3. And the first thing we're going to discuss is going to be something that's going to seem to be completely unrelated to women, completely unrelated to relationships, and it's instead about the person who's watching this video right now. There needs to be a lot of thought put in first to other things before we actually discuss the mechanics of finding a woman. And the first thing I'm going to state is going to be my premise for all of this and sort of explain it. So related to this premise, one of the things that I noticed fairly quickly after getting into the red pill stuff, looking at all of the different techniques and thinking about, the sorts of approaches that are recommended by people who are, frankly, almost invariably in the second category of what I've just given, is that they're all mimicking some sort of virtue. Almost all of them. Not all of them, but like a majority of them. So, for example, there is stuff there to make you seem more confident. There is stuff there to make you seem of a higher fortitude. That's what the gym is about. It's about building fortitude. There are, all manner of different tricks and stuff, which are all related to making somebody appear more virtuous, to to have some sort of good that a certain woman might be looking for. Now, the trouble is that it's a mimicking. It's a mimicking, and it's not something that is real. I find it kind of strange that all of these fellas in the manosphere and stuff are going to spend all of these hours talking about female psychology and working out natures and, getting all of this stuff all well and, sorted out, when, really, this is all just a big waste of time. Because, ultimately, all you're doing is you're perfecting your ability to fake virtue. And so, today we're going to take an alternative approach, and that is that we're going to develop actual virtue. And to properly develop actual virtue, there needs to be a proper understanding of the objective end of human life and what the point of it is. Because you can go and do practical things to develop certain virtues. Like you can go to the gym and lift, and that will build up your fortitude, right? That's one thing, right? But if you have that in the wrong frame of mind, then it can actually be a vice. And that just makes you less attractive, objectively. It will help you with people who are also lacking in virtue, but it's not going to help you get somebody of actual quality, which is ultimately, I think, what most people are looking for. Nobody is looking for a woman or a man who cannot, satisfy their end of the deal in marriage. Nobody is looking for somebody who is incompetent. Nobody is looking for somebody who is unable to fulfill what is necessary for marriage. And this includes even in this kind of foolish error where people think they can just have these short-term relationships and they have no effect. So we're going to discuss a little bit about priorities in life and how to properly aim for this virtue that's going to attract the kind of woman or man that you actually want. So let's start by addressing a couple of myths. So many people online seem to think that genetics are the determining factor in whether or not you're in a relationship, which is of course not true. We see all manner of hideous people around married to one another. You see people whose family has a predisposition to anger develop children that are extremely gentle. So, even if you see these psychological papers, which are, to be honest, extremely tenuous, as we discussed in the previous video, their statistical methods have been broken for 60 years. Even if these things are true, they aren't necessarily inheritable purely through genetics. You can habituate yourself into different ways of behaving. You can, for example, you might have a family full of angry people, but through generosity, through consciously choosing to develop the virtue of generosity and properly ordered charity, you can overcome that, and you can habituate yourself to such a point where people think that you are of a completely different temperament. For example, there was a great saint called Saint Ignatius of Loyola. He was a Spanish knight who was, had almost had his leg blown off by a cannonball. And he was a very aggressive kind of man, right? He was a knight, and he I think it even has a criminal record still in Spain. But through his leg getting blown off and through his conversion to Catholicism in a more deep way, he developed his virtue of generosity to the point where people, rather than thinking he was choleric, which is a more aggressive temperament, they thought he was phlegmatic, which is a more gentle, very friendly, very mild kind of disposition or temperament to possess. Right? So all of these people who say, oh, well, my genetics have doomed me. Even when it comes to looks, you see hideous people married, right? You see people in relationships who are stupid. And even then, we know from history, we know from repeated examples throughout history that those who practice virtues can, to a large extent, completely change their emotional character just through habits, even though they may genetically be predisposed to another kind of way of behaving. It is a matter of choice, and it's a matter of knowing how. So I don't want to see people in the comments section saying, oh, well, X study said Y study said Z, etc. Because it's not true, first and foremost. And second of all, you can get out of it. And all of this scientific studying is pure cope for things that you could fix by yourself. Like, of course, you might not be able to add 1 inch to your height, but that doesn't matter. You've got other ways of being good as well. And I think that just sort of being all sullen and depressed and feeling like you're limited because a bunch of scientists said that you can't do something, I don't think that's any way to live life, and I don't think it's even a way of living life that corresponds to reality. So this is the first thing done. Now we're going to talk about the priorities in life after refuting this. So let's consider a few potential aims in life that people might have. There's God, virtue, status, money, awards, pleasure, and wisdom that I've got written down here. So let us consider awards and status. Awards and statuses are usually indications of some sort of virtue. So, for example, the President of the US is supposed to be somebody who can lead the nation through struggles. That requires a certain level of personal fortitude and a certain level of cunning. Now, we may argue that this hasn't always been the case with certain presidents, but this is ultimately the ideal aim of the particular person in that place. Likewise with graduates from Harvard or Princeton. In an ideal world, these people would graduate with this award by virtue of what they did at Harvard, which actually is supposed to matter. But the thing is that the acts and the status in itself within society do not mean anything. Another one, status in a social group. How you are ranked among your friends and how the power dynamics work there. Again, another indication of something that isn't intrinsically related to what you are. It can be completely arbitrary at times. It can sometimes be actually based on the exact opposite. Sometimes it's the most evil person, the least virtuous person in the room, that is the top of the ladder. And this is exactly what I'm getting at. It's not really built on anything intrinsically, so why would you bother pursuing rewards? Why wouldn't you pursue the things which make you worthy of being rewarded? Because that thing will stick with you forever. You might graduate from Harvard and you're going to feel pretty good for maybe, 15 seconds. You might be CEO of a particular company, but how long is that going to last? Like, you might last a minute and then you've got 2 hours extra to work every day. These, in themselves, are not good life aims. They're not guaranteed, they're not necessarily based on anything, and they only contribute to you in ways of in terms of power, which is a subjective thing. Sometimes power can corrupt, sometimes it's actually quite useful for a particular person to be in a certain position. So, having considered this, let us consider pleasure. Is pleasure the aim of our lives? Are we aiming, when we just pursue what is pleasurable to us, are we going in a good direction? So let's actually rephrase this in a certain way. So let's say we consider pleasure to be good and pain to be bad. I think that's pretty straightforward. The problem is that then if we do some calculus with being born, and we consider the avoidance of evil and the acquisition of good, somebody not being born, in that case, would never experience any pain, so they'd never have any evil. And there's often a refrain that people use saying, well, I was never chosen to be born, right? I was never chosen to be placed in the womb. They will say things like this, and they'll say, well, I had to suffer beyond my own choice. So the whole act of being born is a violation of the will, and this is generally considered, in fact, I'd say it's intrinsically considered to be a violation of this pleasure-pain principle. The very existence of a person inherently, if we just consider pleasure alone, people shouldn't really be born if we consider it from that point of view. What I'm positing here is that this kind of hedonism leads intrinsically to a certain antinatalism, which clearly runs contrary to every intentional urge that human beings have. It runs very contrary to even the consideration of evolutionary goods, which frankly I don't think are a very good way of considering how to run a society, but nevertheless, it runs contrary to what people think. And also, if we were to pursue pleasure, nobody just improves by that. In fact, it is repeatedly noted throughout philosophers that the overindulgence in pleasures and the over-pursuit of these sorts of things and the avoidance of pain tends to leave very mushy, very pathetic people. So I don't think that pleasure is really what we're aiming for here. Let's consider something that maybe the likes of Aristotle might consider to be the highest good, and that would be wisdom. Let's consider wisdom above virtue. We'll consider virtue a bit later. Wisdom is operating in the intellect, so this is like knowing how things work in a way of speaking, and this is, of course, very, very useful. This is very good to know how the world works. But the problem is that it doesn't touch the will, and therefore it doesn't perfect the whole person. Because the human being is something that is always going to be acting in a certain way. It's always an intentional creature. So when I pick up this book that's shielding the microphone, for example, right? That's an intentional action based on my intellect conceiving the ability to pick up this book. The trouble is that wisdom on its own does not touch the will. It dwells solely in the intellect. And so therefore it can't be the greatest good, because it only touches one part of the person. And so this leads us to virtue, which is, in a certain sense, I think it was Plato that said this, a certain wisdom of the rest of the bodily faculties. So in a sense it is the perfection of all of our actions as well as our mind. So wisdom in a sense is a virtue. In fact, Aquinas himself says it's a virtue. So the pursuit of virtue in itself is undoubtedly the highest good for what we've discussed here besides money. We'll discuss that actually in a moment. I should have really mentioned this earlier on. But it is the highest thing that we've discussed thus far, but at the end it ultimately doesn't have a final goal, which doesn't fulfill the need of a man to have a final goal. Like you just get better and better and better and then die, right? What about something intrinsic to the life? There's no sense developing virtues just to die. There has to be some reason for developing those virtues. Just because my faculties are better doesn't dispose them into anything at all. So going back a little bit, we're going to talk about money. Money, it has a similar effect to status in that it gives you power to some degree. But the trouble is that, again, just like awards and just like status, it is something that you cannot control, objectively speaking. You cannot control how you acquire money, because you're ultimately contingent, you're ultimately reliant on your clients, be that your boss, be that the people you're working for, be that even, climactic conditions if you're running a farm, right? It is not something that you can objectively control and always succeed in. And also, it's not something that actually touches you internally. When I earn £1,000 at work, for example, that doesn't touch anything in my soul. That just gives me the means to go and acquire things that might influence my soul, be it virtue or wisdom or whatever. So having discussed those things, we talk about the highest good, which is God. God is the ultimate end of the virtues, because God has made man for himself, and he is therefore the proper aim of all of the virtues. He is the mean which actually balances the virtues. And so therefore our highest aim is to be God. And I think that if you're actually looking for a girlfriend, this may seem very esoteric and unrelated. You need to really review these things and pursue God. Because God is not only the perfection of the virtues, it's the final end of the human person. And if you have any kind of deviation from this actual final end of the human being, then you're going to see this have negative impacts in your relationships. And by this, I don't mean necessarily the opinions of particular people, because these opinions, they don't matter. It's a lot better to be hated by a bunch of people who are evil than to be loved by them, even if it makes you feel all squishy inside. It's about the ability to grow good relationships that we're talking about. And so what I'd recommend everyone here does, even if you're atheist, even if you're Muslim, even if you're Protestant, is go and find a good, detailed Catholic examination of conscience. I will stick one in the description. What this will do is that even where it's applying to the supernatural virtues, which aren't really going to be as necessary in the eyes of atheists and Muslims, but they're still necessary, so they should do those anyway. But particularly Protestants and Catholics, even in those places, like, that will provide you with information on whether or not you're fitting into the virtuous requirements of each of the different virtues. So that could be natural virtues, those virtues that you have without God's grace. So that could be justice or prudence or others. And also those of a supernatural character, faith, hope, and charity. And when you've done that, might actually take you quite a while. It might even take you a few days to do. You'll have a pretty good idea of where you sit in terms of each virtue and where you need to improve, particularly if you're in groups number 2 and 3, as I've just said, right? So, for example, you might be somebody who is just imprudent in behaviour, right? You'll know through looking at these examination of conscience, particularly in terms of the circumstances of the particular offences against those conscience, whether or not you're prudent and whether or not you need to work on that. And so the point of this exercise is, even if you don't go to confession, which you should, this will provide you a way of going, right, this is where I stand, this is where I consider, my place to be. Just through reflecting on your own life and noting down where your issues are. So now, hopefully, after you're in a contemplative mood, you need to consider why you actually want a girlfriend. Because this is extremely important. Like, nobody sets out to look for a woman unless there's something particular they want from them. If you want a woman purely for sex, it's stupid, because this is actually a vice. This is unchastity. And as we discussed in the previous video on my life involved with sort of more red pill movements, it destroys your ability to reason about things, it makes you arrogant, and it makes you despair. So you just want to completely drop this. And I know this is much easier said than done, but a good start will be fasting and prayer. You want to get away from this particular aim as much as possible. The second aim could be for a certain tenderness and love, or to remedy loneliness. This is something that I think that a lot of people can relate to. A lot of people don't want to do the first category. A lot of people will just want that tenderness, and they want to relieve their loneliness. And I really hate to say this, but there are going to be times when you're in a relationship and you're going to feel very, very lonely. You're going to feel completely isolated, and it's also going to be something, it will often be something nothing to do with your partner, right? You will feel intensely lonely. And so, really, being with a woman isn't going to remedy that in any ultimate sense. It might provide, at times, like a passing feeling of, like, I'm not alone in this, and that's, of course, extremely important. In fact, I think that's one of the best parts of a relationship, that tenderness that you get. But it's not a final end. The woman can never satisfy you like anything God can do, right? A woman can, she can help you with certain things. Of course, it's pleasant to love a woman. It's pleasant to be in a relationship, usually. But you're never going to be fully satisfied by that. So again, I'll say fasting and prayer if you want to actually deal with the loneliness problem. And you can even get some tenderness out of prayer as well. So don't consider a relationship just as a cure for your loneliness. Another one is, just something to build up your ego, or like some sort of status symbol. You feel like, oh, I've got a girlfriend, look at me. All this is going to do is set you up for a fall. Because the people who are prideful, they're the people that eventually stumble and just get crushed, right? It is a constant trope, not only in the Bible, but I think also just in history besides that reported in the Bible, that the arrogant are repeatedly thrown down. Whether it be in the light of everyone, or like as a serious stumbling, or even through failings that the arrogant person only notices themselves, and of course in the final end as well. Another one which is more common in right-wing circles is this idea of saving your people and keeping your family going. Maybe that's more relatable, or inserting some sort of evolutionary reason here. So I don't understand this whole. I do understand the whole idea of saving your people, but the problem is that you are in a relationship to perfect your virtues, and your virtues transcend your race, and they transcend your ethnicity. You should marry a woman of another race if she's going to help you be better. It's as simple as that. Like, you shouldn't choose a woman who is more disposed to leave you in the lurch just because she's of the same race of you, if you can marry over a woman who will help you immensely. It's not really the aim of your life to preserve your particular race. I'm sorry. Because the race will ultimately just pass away anyway. It's not an eternal thing. You will die, every person of that race will eventually die. Now, of course, patriotism has its proper place. I don't think it's here, though. Now, keeping your family going, that's a pretty good reason, I think. That's something that's sort of, wide into your head, and it's also somewhat connected to the patriotism I just described, just in a more proximate way. And that's understandable, but again, you should be looking at the higher goods, which are the pursuit of God and virtue. And if you can't do that with somebody, even if it's just you're the last person in your family, and you would do it better celibate, you should remain celibate. And then there's the evolutionary reason. And the problem with this is that, as we've discussed earlier on, God is of a higher rank than virtue. What evolution would consider good would simply be the maximal effectiveness of each of the faculties considered in terms of making you survive longer and produce more offspring. But the trouble is that this isn't actually the highest good. The highest good is God, and sometimes that requires you to do things that are contrary to evolutionary impulse. And so, therefore, the aim of virtue and the aim of acquiring God, right, it transcends purely what evolutionary scientists or what evolutionary theory would dictate. It is not the society that produces the most children, or even the most naturally perfect children, which is the best. It is the one that produces the most, supernaturally perfect. So this would mean, you might be in situations where you fast in such a way that it makes you more weak on a natural level in order to make you more strong on a supernatural level, right? These aims transcend nature. The greatest aim of the human person transcends nature. So going for a purely evolutionary reason doesn't really make sense. Kind of a joke one here, like, say you've got someone to do your dishes for you. I mean, again, this is just a symptom of sloth. Like, she's not a house slave. There's a certain desire for people to be in a kind of a unit, to have... Again, this kind of fits into the idea of a loneliness. And so, therefore, I'd just say, re-listen to what I said about loneliness. To complete yourself is another one. Again, a woman will never complete you. Because she's not, like, actually you. She's not providing you with any virtue of herself directly. She's providing indirect means by which you can develop in the virtues which get you closer to God. It's an indirect means. And so therefore, if you want a woman to complete you, that sort of assumes a kind of a direct purpose, a direct fulfillment that a woman is going to give you. Doesn't happen. And the final one is future marriage, which is like, you love this person, you want to be close to them, and you also want to have children and develop in the virtues and go towards God with them. And this is the ideal aim. Frankly, this is the reason why everyone should get married. So now we've discussed about discerning our reasons for being in a relationship and getting a girlfriend. It's now to think about what sort of traits are we looking for, what sorts of traits do we want to avoid when it comes to picking a good woman, right? And people have spent years and years and centuries and millennia discussing these, and so consequently the internet is filled with lots and lots of advice. So I'm just going to give some very basic overlays here, I think. So I think the primary thing that you want to avoid every single time is arrogance in a woman. So this can be the very pointed arrogance that you see from just talking to a person, to also a lack of regulation in external behaviour, right? This is what modesty actually is, right? It's not this ability to cover up. It's this regulation of exterior behaviour. So this could be how she handles herself around other people. This could also be how she dresses. This could be, her ability to hold, conversation, right? This is the primary thing you want to avoid. If there is a single thing that you can avoid, you could have, it would be better to be married to a woman who is morbidly obese, through no fault of her own, than to be married to an extremely attractive woman who is not virtuous, who is very arrogant. Arrogance is the death of the soul, it's the death of virtue, and so to stick with a woman like this is a really horrible idea. The second one is to avoid a woman who gets drunk all the time. This shows intemperance, and it's also on the same appetite as things that might lead to cheating. You need to consider this very importantly. You don't want a woman who is overly disposed to getting drunk. Of course, the obvious one, you don't want a woman with a poor relationship with her father. I don't think I need to explain that one, because I don't understand the reasoning myself, but this is something that is proven time and time again to show, to lead to a good woman or a bad woman, right? So, what I would say is that I've given you some pretty broad categories here, particularly in the West. Like, I'm sure that some people here are thinking, well, oh, all women are arrogant. There's a huge proportion of women in the West that are arrogant. Yes, of course. There are a huge number, and women have spent their entire lives being encouraged into these exact traits. Particularly the arrogance thing. This is something that is all over Western society. But this is no reason to lose hope. Because you will find a woman who is humble, who is completely the opposite of this, if you are just in such a position to attract such a woman, right? In fact, we've discussed red flags a little bit. I'd like to talk about some blue flags. So, like these flags, or green flags, or whatever we want to call it. These things that you should definitely look for in a woman. And, of course, conversely speaking, we're looking for a person who is extremely humble. You want a woman who is dignified in the way that she dresses. You want a woman who is very controlled in her speech. Someone who's very considerate. Someone who won't immediately throw themselves above another person in a conversation. These things, a proper meditation on humility, I think, and I think you should really do this for the sake of the reconsideration of life and examination of conscience. A true meditation and understanding of humility is something that is desired in a woman. There is nothing greater. It is better to live with a humble woman who is hideous than to live with a beautiful one who is incredibly arrogant. St. John Chrysostom says in one of his homilies on the Epistle to the Ephesians, he says, beauty, it gets old very quickly. You might be able to tolerate her beauty for 6 months or a year, but it's virtue that grows sweeter with age as time goes on, and that's what perfects relationships. So, above and beyond all things, always choose the more humble woman. Always choose the more humble woman. So after a brief consideration of what sort of woman you want to be pursuing, let's consider the various approaches that people will often recommend. So there is this idea of just be yourself, bro, or take a shower. I'm sure that many people here have heard these over and over again, and it doesn't really solve anything. Because it turns out that a lot of the time, being yourself is to be somebody who is full of vices, is completely aimless, and is frankly unattractive. And it's also something that needs to be considered in this, because you don't want to just be yourself, right? You want to be yourself, but always improving, right? You want to be crushing those parts of your personality which are ultimately compromised by vices, right? You are what you eat. If you consume rubbish in terms of what you read, and what you eat, and what you consume, just generally, you'll become like that, right? So if you're constantly playing video games and not really building yourself up in any way to be a either profitable or interesting partner, then don't be bloody surprised when you don't find a woman who's very interesting or of a kind of a tier that you want. If you spend all your time playing video games, if you spend all your time in the gym, if you spend all your time doing these particular activities beyond what is of a good level, these things, it's just gonna turn you into someone who's boring. You're not gonna make a good partner. A good partner is somebody who's well-rounded. You need to be rounded properly. And that leads us on to pick-up artistry and any sort of technique that's going to get a woman. Now, first of all, I think it's kind of dishonest to use techniques. Because, as I've said earlier on, you are basically mimicking a virtue when you do these techniques, or you're mimicking something that's going to attract a woman. But it's not actually there. How many of these PUAs have started out as these, miserable, scared teenage boys who are terrified of women, right? Now, this isn't bad in itself, but they picked the solution that doesn't actually make them courageous, necessarily. They chose the solution that gratifies them. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to be attracting a woman on the basis of something that doesn't exist. You're going to miss a discerning woman if you do that, right? Because a discerning woman, can often be very socially intelligent. They'll tell when you're faking. And so you're going to get a lower tier of woman, a woman that isn't going to be a good mother to your children, isn't going to be a good person to run a household with, and isn't going to be a person who helps to make you happy. You're going to get these sorts of, as many people have discovered, these short-term women that are just basically wastes of time. And so we'll talk about just pursuing virtue, right? Let's say you're just going to pursue virtue. If you're doing this for the sake of a woman, you'll end up like so many people who spend lots and lots of time at the gym when they're single, and then they just get fat when they meet the woman and they get into a relationship, which destroys the virtue. She's not a very good end in herself for the virtue. The virtue is there to actually solve your loneliness problem, or rather, the relationship with God, which is based on certain virtues, is there to solve the loneliness problem. It is there to solve all of these particular depressions or ailments that you're looking for a woman to solve, but really, these women don't solve that. No woman ever can. So, stop pursuing virtue purely for the sake of a woman. And if you're doing so, if you're going to the gym, for example, just to meet a woman, you should probably stop. Because as you pursue that end more and more, it's going to be sunk cost fallacy and you're going to get stuck in it. Right? So, if you're going to go to the gym, just do so to stay healthy. Right? Like, don't go over the top just to attract a woman or have any kind of vain aims, really. Like, deny yourself those aims. And so to now discuss the proper approach to finding a woman. And this is going to probably disappoint a lot of people because it's really simple. Beyond just pursuing virtue. More specific things. And the thing that you've got to realise, guys, and I don't care if you're secular, is that a good wife is the gift from God. And that's all it's going to be. That's all there is to it. You can meet a woman anywhere. I met my girlfriend on Discord, right? You can meet... you can spend all your time at bars meeting terrible women, or you can, pursue virtue and then God, regardless. You could be in a cabin in the middle of the woods. If God wants to give you a wife, then she will find you and you will find her, right? You just got to trust. And the basis, the thing that you can actually do about this is literally to pray for a girlfriend, right? I'm sure that people find that pathetic in a way, but it really works. If you are meant to find a girlfriend, you will be given one. If you are meant to, take up marriage, you will find a good woman if you persist in the ways of virtue and pursue God. It's as simple as that. There may be some exceptions for certain people who are, like, married to people who are bad, but that is because it makes them more virtuous and it makes them aim for a higher thing. But a good woman is a gift from the Lord, right? It's not something that you can do by going to bars hundreds of times a year. It's not something that you'll ever get by staying in the church for a particular amount of time. It's not something that you're going to get by doing all this look maxing or white maxing or I'm going to somehow fake an extra inch in my height kind of nonsense. You're not going to get it that way. The only way that you're going to get a good woman is if you pray for it, basically. If you pray for it, you're of the right state for a woman like that. That is how you're going to get a girlfriend if you're meant to have one. Some of you who are watching, I'm sure, are meant for things that are above the married state. And so if they pray for it, they're not going to get it because it's not for their ultimate good. And seriously, this is my main advice of this video. And it's kind of underwhelming, I know. Literally. Just develop virtue and pray. Praying is the most important thing you can do. As a final point, I wanted to include something from my girlfriend that I'd like to discuss a little bit because she looked over and added a few additional thoughts. And really it can be summed up as a single thing, and that is that you need to be friends with your partner. You need to treat your woman not just as someone you're attracted to. It needs to be a deep friendship as well. You need to, be able to appreciate that person on some level that isn't romantic, right? She thinks that this has to be in the beginning. I'm not so sure. I think that you can have a romantic attachment and then develop the friendship at the same time. I don't know about later on. But I do agree with her that you need to be friends with your partner because, if it's simply a romantic thing and like there's no real deeper connection on like a friendship level, it's just going to fail because you're not going to be able to relate to that person. And yeah, basically, like, try and find a woman you can be friends with. And in fact, this is one of the things that I think that a lot of red pill men need to develop, because a lot of you genuinely hate women. And, it's because you've been reading of all of these stories of horrible women, and there are a lot of horrible women, right? Our society has a way of raising them. But, like Nawalt, literally, not all women are like that. If you develop proper virtues, you'll attract a woman who isn't a completely horrible, arrogant person, right? And so, maybe not meeting good women, like, I said a lot of this stuff on Renaissance Man, where I was like, oh, just meet them, oh, like, you can meet them. You can meet them, sure, but I think it's a lot more of a random process than people think. And so I think that all you can really do is sit there, be of a disposition to attract a good woman, and then it's basically, wait and pray. So that's basically the video that I'm going to do on this. I'd actually like to hear in the description your guys' opinions on this. I did a poll yesterday where I asked people for sort of common, I suppose I should have made it more clear, like secular dating advice, stuff like don't change yourself for your partner, right? But also for red pill, dating advice and red pill techniques. And what I've got is I've got a text file with all of this stuff written down, and I'm thinking of making a video on this, or maybe breaking them down into various videos to talk about in the future, right? Because I've done the previous video, and I was thinking, well, why don't I expand it a little bit further and see where this goes? So, anyway, my 2 cents. I'm a young man. I don't necessarily have the experience of some other people, but a lot of this is based on reading the fathers and my own experiences. What I can say for certain is really just ignore most of the red pill stuff, because a lot of it comes from fear, and it's not always the most rational fear. So, see you guys, and I hope you liked the video. Thanks a lot for watching. Please share this, actually. Please send this to people. Like, this channel will spread most through word of mouth, and if you know people who would benefit from this, please send them. Bye-bye.